Listen-only mode.
Good morning or afternoon or possibly evening, and welcome to another Webinar Wednesday. Today is the second Wednesday of January. Happy 2015 from the AI people. And today we are going to have Emily Short, who has just clicked onto another slide, so I don't know what the title of her presentation is.
Sorry, there you go.
So here we go, challenges in interactive narrative and how AI can help. And since I've seen the other slide where she does a far better intro than I would have done for her, I will leave her to introduce herself. You shot yourself in the foot a little bit there, Emily. So without further interruption, please tell us about interactive narrative, Emily.
All right. Greetings, everybody, and thank you for having me. I am Emily Short. I'm the author of numerous works of interactive fiction, including a long time ago a game called Galatea, and more recently a game called Counterfeit Monkey. I was one of the leads on the Versi project, which is a project on simulating agent-driven behavior and social situations. And I do assorted consulting on interactive narrative and conversation modeling for a wide range of different games. So I do some work on indies, I've done some AAA consulting, I've done some work on MMOs, really kind of a range of things. But my own background does not really come from AI to start with, and indeed not from computer science or gaming at all. I started out as a classics PhD, and I was interested in stories. I became interested in how stories could be made interactive. And so I'm going to kind of follow that same journey in this presentation, in that I'm going to start out by talking about sort of what the challenges of making a narrative interactive are like, and then look at a bunch of particular pain points that there are in implementation, and then look at some projects that have tried to address those in various ways, especially things that are either AI and recently published actual game work or experimental AI that's being worked on at a hobbyist or academic level. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop those into the window at any time. So to start out with a very sort of quick overview of, and this may be incredibly obvious, what is the usual structure of a story? What are most stories like? Inevitably, you start out with the protagonist who's facing some kind of conflict. Something's happened, they don't like it, they want to change it. And the conflict needs to be something that feels believable. And when I say it feels believable, what I mean is not like you think that this could actually happen in the real world, but that within the context of the story that you're telling, it seems like a compelling situation that could actually occur. So if you're watching a Star Trek episode and the characters are having a problem because the transporter beam is malfunctioning, that can be believable within the context of the story, even if you don't believe in transporter beams as technology. And similarly, they need to have stakes that are important to both to them and to you. So there needs to be some reason why they're invested in this conflict, and there's some reason why the viewer or reader or participant should care about that as well. Then the protagonist needs to take some action to do something about this conflict. There are some stories in which mostly things are being driven by other people, and the protagonist is just reacting to them, but those tend to feel a little bit weaker. So you want the protagonist to be doing something to respond to that conflict in some way. And if you want it to be a story that is about characters, personality, or about moral themes, or about sort of cultural systems, then usually that action doesn't just sort of happen in isolation, but it needs to be something that either expresses values that they have or represents a change in their values. Maybe they're doing something that they wouldn't ordinarily do because of this conflict they've gotten into. And then usually, unless it's going to be a very short, very boring story, they don't instantly get a resolution for their conflict. Usually their first attempt to solve whatever the problem is does not work out for some reason. But it does change the situation in some way. So maybe I have managed to get the magic what's-it in order to overthrow the evil king, but in the process of using it, I've released this demon into the world that I now have to defeat. So I've stepped up from the previous conflict that I had to something that's of higher stakes or even more serious or even more my fault. And now we kind of re-enter that system again. I'm still facing the same conflict or an escalated version or a replacement conflict. And again, I need to take some action. And at this point, if I've struggled and failed to resolve something multiple times, that might be occasion for me to change my approach to how I'm going to deal with it. So if I've tried to resolve a conflict in a way that I feel is ethical the first time around and it didn't work and I'm really frustrated, then I might be faced with either, I'm going to give up or I'm going to change my ethical values and I'm going to do something different this time. So this kind of structure is the underlying substrate of a large majority of stories that we might want to tell in some function. So when we go to build this into a game world, there are some additional challenges that can arise. So when we say things like the conflict feels believable, games introduce new ways for conflicts to not feel believable. So for instance, if I'm writing a story about a character who is facing being bullied by people, but the game mechanic is one in which that character, has a gun and runs around shooting people, it's not clear why I shouldn't be able to use that same kind of ability in the story cutscenes and say, you know what, I'm tired of you, I'm just going to shoot you and move on. So you need that kind of cohesiveness between the mechanics and the story in order to keep the story conflict believable within the fiction. Stakes, this is a big one. Things that are stakes for the protagonist are not necessarily the same things that are going to feel like stakes for the player. So when the player is playing a game, the things that are stakes for them might have to do with, if I make this decision, then I'm going to get a power-up. If I make that decision, then I'm going to lose an NPC that might be a valuable ally to me in the future. So there are things where I'm thinking about how likely is this to improve or damage my play experience, or to allow me to win, or to allow me to play in the way that I want to play. Like I might be motivated to try and get a ranged weapon if I prefer playing that style of combat. Whereas the protagonist stakes might be a completely different set of things. Protagonists might be motivated by self-interest for the protagonist, and that might seem like the same thing as winning, but it's not necessarily. So I've played, for instance, there's an interactive fiction game called The King of Shreds and Patches, which is kind of a Cthulhu Lovecraftian universe where horrible things can happen to you. And it's a really good example of where the player stakes and the protagonist stakes diverge, because when you're playing this game, you're constantly curious about the dark mysteries that are going on. You want to find out what's happening, even though finding them out will drive the protagonist mad and kill him. So the player constantly has this urge to check this stuff out and then restore a saved game, whereas the protagonist would be motivated to not do those things at all in order to stay alive. Similarly, the protagonist might have a set of personal values, like I have a code of honor that only allows me to do this or that. If I'm writing a piece of sort of standard fiction about this character, I can just say, he's got a code, and because I say he does, and that's what he's going to do. Whereas if you've got the player involved in this story, the player might not be particularly invested in that set of values. And similarly, a protagonist might be motivated by a concern for other characters, like I don't want to do this because it's going to hurt my friend, I'm worried about how my mother will feel about it, all of this kind of thing. And again, there's a question of whether the player is going to share that investment in a given context, especially if it's evident to the player that these other characters are purely mechanical NPCs and they're not particularly responsive, so I might not, as a player, have as much urge to worry about them as a source of narrative stakes as the protagonist is supposed to. And that same issue comes up when we look at the idea of a character who changes their values. A lot of great stories are about characters who undergo some sort of transformation because of a stressful experience that they go through. Either it might be a good transformation or it might be a bad one. They might find new purpose or they might relinquish a long-held belief. But in any case, unless there's some connection between the player and the protagonist at that point, you're going to lose the kind of power of those moments narratively in an interactive context. So those are all areas where we have to kind of think carefully about what we're doing in a design way in order to make all of those pieces work properly, so that they, by work properly, I mean it still feels like a good story, it still conveys a kind of coherence and good pacing and all those kinds of things, but it's got enough room for the player to feel like they're really enjoying the interactivity of this. So where this leads us to look at sort of specific ways that this becomes difficult to implement, and this is what the majority of this talk will be about. Why are each of these things hard to make happen, and then to what extent can AI help dig us out of that hole again, if it can? So the big problem, if we're putting the player in a situation where they need to take action and their first attempt should either fail completely or fail in a way that produces interesting progress, or succeed but have negative results. All of those things are things where we're changing the world situation, and if we want to give the player significant freedom, like you can choose to do this or not do this, you can choose to do this in different ways, you can choose to confront the bully or run away from him, each of the times that we do this, we need to build enough content to make this story responsive to what their choice was from then on. So giving enough content that the player feels like their options are effective in the game world is one of the biggest problems in this area. And you can do it, there are ways of doing this by simply hand creating enormous amounts of content. And if you look at a lot of BioWare games do this. There's some classic interactive fiction that does this. The very popular mobile game 80 Days just has a huge number of words in it, just a huge number of things that have been handwritten as responses to different kinds of situations that you can be in. And that's one way of dealing with this. But the more you kind of proliferate those options for the player and the richer you make their range of possibilities, and the longer you make the story, the more you run into this content generation problem. So there are several ways to kind of try and adjust to that problem and deal with it in some way. So one approach is to do things where the smaller pieces of the story are responsive to what you've done so far in a way that's kind of templatized. And we see this in the Skyrim's Radiance system. The system is designed to create a bunch of quests for players that are going to be things where it's at the appropriate level of difficulty. The quest giver is somebody that the player has not yet killed off, who's not yet experienced some problem. The quest is located in the right part of the world. It's an appropriate stage for us to be at. And so the way that this works is to have a series of sort of quest templates that can then be filled in by saying, okay, here's a quest where the quest giver here could be any of the following types of people. You can have the quest giver be any bandit, and then any character that's tagged with that capacity is somebody who might be able to slot into that role. Now the flip side of this is that this is not a system that's really ideal for generating primary narrative, because it has to be a little bit on the generic side. If you're writing a quest where the quest giver and the quest target could be anybody selected from kind of a pool of possibilities, then there's only so specific you can make the narration around that quest without having it just fall apart. But nonetheless, this is a way of saying, okay, we don't have time to write all of this sort of explosive combinatorics of the number of quests that we would need to deal with all of the different world states that you could get into and all of the different people you might have killed off. So we're going to do it this way and slot people in. A more sort of ambitious plan that does get to kind of the main narrative strand. This is quite an old game, actually, King of Chicago from 1987. Is a game. It had a sequence of scenes, and each scene had certain prerequisite rules about what was allowed to, when that scene was allowed to happen, and when it was particularly fitting for it to happen. And each time that a scene ended, it would then go back to its scene collection, and it would look for something that was the next best fit for whatever world state we were in. So the advantage of that is that it's a highly flexible approach to narrative. It's hard for the player to get into any situation where it could not select another scene to happen next. But on the other hand, it's not always necessarily completely obvious how the player's choices have affected a particular scene transition. So you might do something that has an effect on the world state, but then the scene picker comes up with something where it's not completely obvious what the connection is. So depending on how much content there is, that can work better or worse. Dealing with the same type of problem, Prom Week is a game which is focused on social interaction. It has a very rich internal world model, and the world model tracks all kinds of things that you can have done with other characters. So the premise of the game is that you're trying to get different characters together during the week leading up to prom. Characters can have different interpersonal history. They might have dated before. They might be friends. All kinds of things can be in the background. And when you have the character, the protagonist, try to interact with one of these characters in the role of another character, the dialogue that comes back needs to reflect that world state in some way. So if I'm a nerdy person and I'm asking out a jock character, then we want to have dialogue where my line hitting on the jock is an appropriately nerdy flirt line, and the jock's response is appropriately athletic person response. And maybe if in the past we had some bad history, we might want to reference that, and so on. So the way that the system currently works is that, again, it's doing a search for the most salient possible piece of dialogue given what it knows about the world state. It will look for the piece of dialogue that's tagged to match that as well as possible. But again, if you're dealing with primarily hand-authored dialogue, as the release version of this game is, there are going to be many, many possible world states that are not accounted for by the hand-authored dialogue in a very salient way. So you might have the experience of, oh, I have a history with this person, but there isn't actually any dialogue available to reflect our history. So the dialogue that I get back is not going to be as nuanced as possibly it could be. And one of the sad things about that is that it helps conceal from the player, and not in a good way, sort of the actual depth that the world model has. Right? The world model actually knows all this stuff. It's just not able to show it to you. So one approach that they've taken is sort of exploring how could we expand on this and make it better at presenting salient responses, is to take the pieces of hand-authored dialogue that we already have and recombine that dialogue in a procedural way, and then add that bank of new dialogue to the system as a set of available additional dialogue pieces. So it might look at, okay, I've written this exchange of dialogue to happen between a nerd and an athletic person, and I've also written this other piece of dialogue to happen between people who used to be enemies. And now I'm going to look at those pieces that have been tagged, and I'm going to find a way to recombine them and build a piece of dialogue that's specific to nerd hits on a jock where they had a past history, and build out the corpus of available material that way. So this is not happening in real time during the game itself, but it's making that new content available in order to use after it's been created. The Scheherazade project is kind of related to that idea in that it's exploring ways to procedurally generate coherent narratives that stick together. And it's about sort of tagging pieces of narrative and seeing what sequences can be sensibly built out of them. So exploring things like crowdsourcing corpuses of story data, like saying, here on Mechanical Turk, please write for us a narrative about a bank robbery, and get dozens or hundreds of people to write lots and lots of short narratives about this. Go through, tag up that material, recombine it procedurally, improve the system for procedural recombination, and then some other tweaks on it. Like they've recently done some work on attitude variation so that you could change the way that things were being reported depending on the attitude that the person who was telling the story was supposed to have towards the events. So the idea here again is this system is on the research end. It's not actually a finished game per se, but what it's exploring is how can we build procedural content that is flexible enough and diverse enough that can be put in these situations in order to reflect the exact details of the world state that we've currently gotten into. So that's the content generation issue. Another issue that we run into with the sort of putting player agency inside a story is that players don't necessarily respect the kind of rules that we might have for ourselves about how to tell a story elegantly. So we have lots of sort of pre-understood ideas about what sort of pacing should there be when we're telling a story, how long should pieces drag out, how should we alternate between intense and more mild scenes, how do we alternate between conflicts and exposition, all of that kind of thing. Similarly, we have expectations about coherence, right? We have the idea that if we introduce something early in the story, that thing should probably recur later in the story if it seemed important. If we just drop it, it seems weird and we wonder where that went. But it's really easy for those sorts of things to happen in a procedural narrative because the player might encounter some object or some people or some side quest early in the story that has the potential of paying off later, but then if they do the wrong things, it doesn't get brought back in, and so we lose that sense of coherence that was at best a potential in the story we created and not guaranteed. So there are a couple of things that people have done to deal with this in games that are already released. Left 4 Dead obviously is not sort of heavy on developing a classic narrative, but it's definitely dealing with this pacing issue of we want there to be moments of high tension and then we want there to be moments of rest in order to build up the suspense. And so they did a lot of work into handling that. How do we insert new events and when do we insert new events in order to keep the moment-to-moment pacing experience of the narrative, of the fictive layer of this the way we want it. And also doing a little bit of that sort of salience matching, again, of looking at here's the situation that we're in, right? We've just been attacked by this guy, or a group of 3 of us has just wandered into this new area. What is the most appropriate character bark that I could insert at this moment? I'm going to put that in there in order to give that sense of the characters responding to the situation that they're in. This is a more experimental piece. The Automated Story Director is a project, again, at the Entertainment Intelligence Lab, which did Scheherazade. This is a system that is trying to adaptively respond to things that the player has done. So in contrast, we're talking about one strategy is to just generate a huge amount of content that is able to be slotted into place no matter what the player has done. Another approach is to say, no, we're actually going to replan the narrative entirely in response to what the player does. So if the player has just killed the person who is supposed to be the quest giver, I'm going to work out a new plot graph based on that thing, and I'm going to then do whatever I need to do in order to make that plot graph come about. So the way that this works is the NPCs most of the time behave autonomously. They've got their own kind of little rules about what they want to be doing. But the story director can intervene at any time and tell the NPC, okay, you need to focus on doing this next. And that takes priority, and they'll then plan how to transition into that action and perform the appropriate action in order to move the story forward according to the new graph. So it's trying to sort of repair the story on the fly in response to whatever the player might have done that could be a problem for it. Facade is an enormously ambitious piece of work, and so I'll be mentioning it a couple of times in this talk. But one of the ways in which it's ambitious is that it's doing drama management where it has a series of different kinds of story beats, like characters welcoming you to their home. Their pair of characters, you are walking in to talk to them. They're in the middle of having this fight, so there are beats to their story that are about them welcoming you, them responding to your presence, them starting to get on each other's nerves, them getting into a full-blown fight in front of you, all of these kinds of things. So the drama manager is constantly selecting from those beats based on not only what is possible to have happen next, but also what is going to fit the intensity arc that I've decided I want to do. So, you know, if you pick the more extreme sort of fighting moments, only later in the story, and start out with something a little bit gentler. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about here was how do we deal with this issue of the player's values and the protagonist's values, and the sort of how the player imagines the protagonist and how that interacts with the narrative. So we might want to look at things like what attitudes does the player have towards the main themes of the game. We're not really interested in building sort of a complete personality profile for the player, but we do want to know, with respect to the things that are going on in this story that are the important value structures that are at work, what's their take on that? How do they feel about it? What might they think about these decisions? And so there are some reasonably low-tech solutions to this kind of problem. Choice of Games has made a kind of brand out of the idea of personality-based play, and all of their games start out with you answering a bunch of questions about what kind of person your protagonist is, which might often be what you yourself are comfortable with. If it's not, it's still something that you have been involved in directly choosing. So as a player, you have some investment in the protagonist being a particular way. If I decide, okay, I'm going to make my protagonist this bad boy character, then I might have some investment in trying to continue to play that character in a cohesive way that sticks with the vision that I created for them at the beginning. So the story tracks all of these stats that you set up early on, in that sense that it's quite like an RPG of the standard kind, except that it's really focused on personality more than on things like how good are you at shooting a bow. So it's taking that same kind of mechanic and pulling it into a more personality and narrative part of the spectrum. Then we have things like the reputation system in Fable, where it's tracking your protagonist's behavior in order to come up with a moral profile for you. It tags everything that you do as either good or bad, or high or low purity, and then it shapes your character in particular ways as a result of this. Along the same lines, in Fallout 3, you've got, it looks like I missed the end of my sentence there, sorry. You've got certain missions that appear if you've done the right things in the past or if you have the right affiliations. So these become a way for the player to do a certain amount of self-expression, because as you see your character's profile evolving, you might decide you want to tweak it in one way or another. You might become invested in your protagonist being really saintly or really demonic or anything like that. But this is a system that I find somewhat limited personally, and one of the reasons that I find it limited is that it's working on a fairly simplistic axis of good and evil to start with, and secondly, it will assign its own meaning to actions that you take that may or may not be what you as a player intended to assign. So I still remember getting really annoyed with Fable 3 because it assigned me negative points, evil points, for what it thought was me breaking into somebody's house, but actually I just wandered into this building and I didn't understand that I was in the wrong place, and I was very irritated that was how it turned out. So there are some risks about trying to profile the player this way. You can also ask the player direct questions. This is a very strange game, Catherine by Atlas, which is about a guy who is considering whether to stick with his girlfriend or not and is tempted by somebody else. And the sections of the game are broken up by these questions where you kind of as yourself, the player, not necessarily as this character, are asked questions about how you relate to other people and what kind of relationship morality you have. And then you see how your choice relates to the sort of overall stats that other people had. And it's a way of kind of keeping the player focused on these issues and challenging the player to think thematically about relationship morality at the same time that they're playing out this guy's saga. So you're kind of drawn to think about your own past, your own background, your own beliefs, and how that connects with what the protagonist is going through, and keeps things sort of thematically focused that way. Silent Hill Shattered Memories, again, is doing some looking at what the player does and drawing conclusions about you, though in this case it's a mix of the active and the passive. And by that I mean there are some things where it's asking you questions as part of sort of psych profiles and that sort of thing, and there are other things where it's drawing conclusions just based on the player behavior. So if as a player you examine certain objects, you show interest in certain kinds of things, the game can decide, oh, that means this about you. You spend a lot of time looking at liquor bottles, so you must be a drunkard. And those sorts of things come together to then affect what other scenes you're shown after that and how you're treated by the game from then on as it's drawing these conclusions. So it's really kind of conflating the player and the protagonist in that way and saying what you're interested in and what the protagonists are interested in are the same thing, and I'm going to build the narrative around that idea. Similar kinds of things are going on and are being researched outside the area of games. So a place where they're doing some sort of interesting work on how to track what people are interested in and how to look at modeling the player or modeling the interactor in this case. There's a project called Chess, which is an augmented reality project for museums. And the way that it works is there are a large number of different segments of information that you might be interested in that are associated with different exhibits in the museum. And as you start out, you're allowed to select, okay, I want to see this, I want to see that in association with this object. But as you go along, it's actually building up a model of what your interests are. So if you were selecting to view a lot of information about sort of daily life in ancient Greece, then it might start actively leading you towards or proposing to you, suggesting to you additional things that seem to fit that particular interest. So this is an area where there's something that's it's not primarily a game-focused concern, but it is further research into how do we figure out what it is that the interactor is indicating an interest in, even without necessarily having decided to express that interest, and then how can we tailor and customize the experience that they have in response to that, whether that's through some kind of recommendation system or that's through I'm now going to weight the scenes that I could show next in this narrative based on what I've learned from this character. This, again, Fallen London does something interesting with building on the decisions of the protagonist. This is a browser-based MMO, and the way that it does this is it's tracked your affiliation with a range of different groups that you might be interested in, people that you might have made friends with. You may spend a long time building up connections to these different groups, and that tends to reflect where your interests are in the game. So again, this is a way of sort of monitoring what do you seem to have invested in as a player, and what do you seem like you care about. And then once you've committed to several different groups and you've got an interest in both of them, it will then start generating events that put those groups into conflict with one another and force you to choose between them. So it's trying to by doing this, it's trying to create or select for you narrative moments that are going to represent a significant conflict of values for the protagonist that you created, and also sort of for the player, because as a player you have indicated that you care about these connections that you could have. So you then have to pick which of these things do I care about more, and it's meant to be a more significant conflict than if it were just arbitrarily picking from the whole range of groups that it might pit against each other, or the whole range of choices it might make you choose between. It's selected based on what you care about. So now we're on to something very near and dear to my heart, which is how do we make the player care about other characters enough for the other characters to be significant in building stakes, to be a key part of the story. A big part of the answer to this is how do you convince people that an NPC has an inner life of any kind? And some of this has to do with, are they expressive? Do they appear to have feelings? There's a whole lot here, which I'm not even going to try to get into today, to do with sort of dynamically animating things, making people have persuasive faces and persuasive ways of talking, generating dialogue that carries emotional weight, generating or selecting voiceovers that carry emotional weight, but all of those kinds of things, the more you can make it seem like the character has actual feelings, the more they're going to seem significant to the player. Similarly, are they responsive? Do they notice what you've done as a player? Do they react to you? And are they active and appear to have their own agenda? Because if a character just seems to be waiting around indefinitely for you to interact with them, they're much less likely to seem to you like a real person, and they're more likely to seem like a placeholder NPC, and if they're a placeholder NPC, then it means you don't have to care how they feel, and you're allowed to do whatever you want with them. So if you want them to be an important part of your story, then you need to make it seem like they have all of these aspects to them. And there are, again, this is a recurring theme here, there are not that expensive ways of doing this some of the time. So the famous sort of Walking Dead message, Clementine will remember that, is the game telling you what you just did was important. And not only was it important, and not only is it being stored somewhere in the code, but it's the way that that's described to you has been personalized is not just the game is going to remember that, but this character remembers that. And whether you believe them or not, I mean, for all I know, they're just sticking this message up here. It might not even be true all the time, but what it does for the player is say, this is a character who has an interior, this is a character who has memory, who has a personality, and what you've done matters to them. So there's a space there that you should begin modeling that character the way that you would model another person and think about how do they feel, what do they remember, what do they care about. So some really interesting stuff has been done with the Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor, which selects orcs to be your nemesis, your sort of counterpart in the course of play, and those orc characters have their own traits, they have their own names, they have a memory, they level up over time, they level up in response to things that you do to them, they level up if they succeed in killing you, which is cool. They can refer back to times that they fought with you in the past if you meet them again. And it's also generating character appearance and the sort of voiceover traits based on how this character has been rolled. So this is hitting a number of these points, right? You've got a character that seems to have a memory, it seems to have an ambition in that it's trying to move up through the ranks of its army in the same way that you're leveling up yourself. So that kind of creates a sense of here's a character that's a bit of a counterpoint to me in a real sense. Like the rules of its universe are the same rules of my universe, and that matters. Still, most of the interaction that you're having with these characters is by means of fighting, but this still creates this kind of tension around these characters that might not otherwise exist. In a very different kind of context, a very different kind of genre, Blue Lacuna is a text adventure from a few years back. This is 2008, an enormous freeware text adventure. And it has one major NPC. There are one or two other characters that turn up, but they're not on stage most of the time, so it's almost entirely about this other character. But the character is insanely responsive to what you do, and not only in the sense of things that you say to this character matter, but the character is watching all of your behavior all the time in a way that's completely unprecedented in text adventures and in most other genres. So if you pick up an object that belongs to this character, he'll remember that you've done that and that you treated his possessions as though they were yours. If you come and go in the middle of a conversation, he might notice that. And everything that you're doing is causing him to change how he assesses you on several different axes. So it's not just an I like you, I don't like you affinity. It's I consider you dominant or submissive, I'm romantically interested in you or not, those sorts of things. So it's got multiple ways in which it's tracking everything that you're doing in the presence of this NPC. And then it's got different kinds of conversation interaction scenes that can start with you based on where it's placed you in its chart so far. So this guy might behave in a surly way towards you if he feels dominant but he doesn't like you, and those sorts of things. And that all sort of plays out in a way that feels very much like you're developing a relationship with this character over the course of play. And it's quite a long game, so you have lots of opportunities to go away and come back and interact with him again and again and get this evolving relationship with him. Again, prom week I wanted to come back to and talk about here as well, because this gets into the territory of using social simulation as a significant mechanic of the game. So the couple of things that we've been talking about just now are games that are primarily about other kinds of interaction. Blue Lacuna is about puzzle solving in a kind of text adventure way with lots of gadgets that you manipulate, and Shadow of Mordor, obviously you're doing combat and so on. But there's a whole new level that you can get out of character depth and interaction if the primary game mechanic is actually about social simulation, because then you're asking the player, think about this story and this game according to how you imagine, like your primary focus in order to figure out how to win this is going to be about how you imagine these characters feel about you and what you intuitively sense is the correct way to treat them. So in prom week, for instance, it's explicitly modeling a bunch of different social contexts, and then it decides in these social situations what are the range of things that you possibly could do. And then if you select to do one of those things, it might say, you know, I'm going to bully this guy. Then it goes back to the world model, looks at how he's likely to respond to being bullied and has him react that way. And those aspects encourage the player to think about the other character's feelings as the primary activity of the game. Like that is what you're doing all the time. Similarly, and this is the project that I myself worked on with Richard Evans, the Versi project is about social simulation and conversation simulation. So again, it's modeling what kind of thing is going on socially at the moment, what's happening, and given that we know that that's what's happening, what are you allowed to do now? So we might be modeling, here's a dinner time conversation. During a dinner time conversation, the appropriate things for you to do are say this, this, or this. You are dancing with somebody, appropriate things that you can do while dancing are ask somebody to dance, say yes or refuse, that kind of thing. So everything that's going on, all of the possibilities of the game, all of the options that are being offered to the player are based on a social model of what's happening, which can be influenced by objects and locations in the world, but the social situation is the primary unit that it's modeling. And it's also got a fairly complicated model of conversation under the hood. So it needs to be robust enough to handle the fact that characters can be coming in and out of the room. You might be talking to different groups of people. People might be in different moods. They might have different attitudes towards you based on how you've interacted with them in the past. And it needs to be constantly figuring out how to move the conversation forward in a coherent way based on all of that. And the way that it's doing that is that it's got a very large body of handwritten dialogue, but that dialogue is tagged up with a bunch of information. So it's not just this line has to follow that line, but here are a number of lines that could follow this line. Here is the social action that is implied if you say this sentence. So if you say a polite greeting to somebody, that's going to be registered in the system as a polite greeting. Here are the topics of conversation that this dialogue is about. And it's constantly trying to find the things for people to do in reaction to those that are most fitting based on their agency and their feelings about you and what they're willing to do. So there's a great deal more about how this system works if you're curious on Versu.com. And I could talk about it at great length, but I will not here. An even more sort of ambitious attempt is Chris Crawford's ongoing project, which was Erasmatron and then has gone under or has been sort of revamped as Storytron and so on. And Chris Crawford is really kind of the mad desert prophet of social simulation interactive fiction, and his vision is all about all of the gameplay should be about interacting with other characters. It should be primarily all the time about how people feel about each other. It should be hugely generative. It should be minimally pre-authored. It should be all about characters responding to one another in this fluid holodeck-like way. And this has produced a series of sort of enlightening failures. And I don't think I'm being mean by saying that. I think that's how he would describe it himself. But he's still kind of working on this project in some ways. So if you're curious about kind of the current state of it, that's the blog that's following the community around that right now. So then the flip side of if we're doing social interaction social simulation stories, then there's a challenge again of creating that content in the first place. So I know you're going to be hearing from Jeff Orkin, I think, next month, so I won't over-explain this, but there's a project by Jeff Orkin called The Restaurant Game, whose purpose was not to throw the player into a pre-created social simulation, but to learn how to build a convincing social simulation based on crowd input. So the way that it worked was to give a lot of people access to a scenario in which they played either the waitress or the customer in a restaurant, and they interacted with each other, and then the system tracked what all of their actions were and built this big corpus of, if somebody does this, here's a likely response. If they do that, here's a likely response. And then collating and tagging all of that information allows them to create the kind of large and really robust database of social behaviors that could then be fed back into a social simulation game experience. So there are also some people who are working on things where instead of giving the player a set of previously delineated options, they're allowing actual natural language conversation with the characters. So A Tough Sell is a chatbot-based story about the situation that you are the evil old queen in Snow White, and you have come to find Snow White and try to convince her to eat the poisoned apple. So clearly putting you in a friendly role there. But the deal is you are supposed to carry on dialogue with this character until she trusts you enough to eat the apple. And it's building this on Bruce Wilcox's chat script technology. And it's an interesting play experience because, again, what it's evoking is you're trying to figure out what is this character looking for, and then what kind of dialogue would allow me to move this forward. So for me, the sort of exciting moment in playing with this was when I realized that I could make Snow White trust me more by saying mean things about the queen, i.e. myself, except that I was in disguise, so she didn't know that. And sort of reckoning, okay, there are these ways of making it seem like I'm more on her side of things. So that can produce a good experience when it's working, and that other times it can produce a very sort of frustrating experience if the natural language processing is not working in a way that corresponds to what you expected. Along the same lines, with the same problems, Facade also does natural language interpretation, and specifically what it's doing is looking at what you have typed in as dialogue to communicate with these main characters, and then assigning some sort of social significance to what you've done. So was what you said probably a compliment? Was it probably rude? Were you hitting on one of them? Were you just saying some random thing? And then it interprets, once it's translated that natural language input into a social gesture of some kind, it then goes on and interprets that social gesture within its social context in much the same way that Prom Week does, that it actually shares some engine aspects in that respect. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about, and I'll make this brief because I know that we're sort of coming to the end of our time, is this issue of making sure that the problem that the protagonist has is something that is tied in with the parameters of the world, is well integrated with the rules, the game structure. Are the fictional problems and the game mechanics relying on the same systems? Are they working together? Are they working cohesively? So there are some games that have really just embraced that. And they've put aside a lot of the other things that I've raised as issues and said, okay, we're going to do the simulation first. We're going to make it all about the world model. We're going to run the world, and then players can derive a story from that if they want to. So things like Sims 3 or things like Dwarf Fortress, where there are lots of fun things going on all the time, and it may or may not form into any kind of cohesive story, and there's nothing structurally in place to try to make it be a cohesive story, although players may personally choose to try and push it in that direction. So sometimes when I'm playing Sims 3, I will try to engineer particular types of conflict between the characters because I'm just interested in seeing how that will work out. But it's really inviting the player into a different kind of attitude towards the story, where they're kind of a co-wrangler of the story with you. You kind of put the player in the position of being partially the drama manager and partially the reinterpreter, the narrator. And so this is why you see people making big, long blog posts about here's what happened to my Sims 3 characters, because they've invested deeply in making this story. But the story aspect is not being modeled as such in the game at all. You can have stories in which the mechanics are very tightly woven together with the ways that fictional decisions are being made. I think one of the most wonderful examples of this in recent time is Papers, Please, where the gameplay is all about deciding whom to let into the country and whom to keep out, and some of the time that's a very tedious mechanical technical task, and some of the time it is actually making an important narrative decision about this guy has just come to my window and made an impassioned plea to be let in, and I'm going to help him or not help him. But that's all expressed in a consistent way through the system, which is very useful. And similarly, the mechanics sometimes can exist to produce a particular emotional effect. And we were talking earlier about this idea of a splitting of goals between the player and the protagonist, but part of the way of getting the protagonist to have, or getting the player to understand the protagonist's feelings, is if the mechanics of the game actually produce those feelings in the player. And perhaps the easiest feeling to produce in a player is the feeling of frustration. So stories about frustrated protagonists are particularly easy to develop through games, and these are two examples I'm particularly fond of. Cart Life, which is about being down on your luck and having the entire system of your city not really work in your favor, and Mismanagement, which is about being an office manager for a bunch of sort of difficult to handle coworkers. And in both cases, you develop as a player strong feelings that mirror the protagonist's feelings just from having to interact with these systems and characters in a way that's annoying. Like, this character does not want to do his work and it's making my life harder, and therefore I, the player, am annoyed with him in exactly the same way that the protagonist would be. So these suggest that there are some ways of situating the player with respect to this story that either pull them apart from the protagonist or give them a different kind of experience than one where they're just imprinting themselves on the game. So last set of examples, Bear 71 is an interactive documentary with some game-like features. And the way that this works is there's a voiceover that's describing the story of this bear living in a national park in Canada, what happens to it, why it happens, and the voiceover runs continuously and is not something that you interact with. However, there is this interactive map that you can move around and see different characters in. And so your role as a player is not to control the bear or to control any of the other actors or anything like that, but you're functioning as kind of a co-curator of the experience by picking out what you're interested in looking at, and often picking out what you're interested in looking at in response to things that you've learned from the voiceover. So if the voiceover talks about sort of trains in the park and how disruptive they are, you might be motivated then to go actually look on the map at the train tracks and so on. But it's up to you, and you can pick whatever you want. So it creates this very kind of fluid connection between the pre-scripted experience and the play experience. It's quite an interesting way of telling that story. Icebound is a piece of experimental interactive narrative in which the player is explicitly a co-author. And what you're doing is you're selecting objects and symbols that are going to be important in this story, and then it's generating new pieces of narration in response to that. So you might be working on writing chapter 1, and you decide that in chapter 1 the knife is going to be important, and it tells you what the knife means thematically, and then you can, once you've sort of assembled different pieces of symbolism and looked at the text that has come out because of the symbols that you picked, you can decide, I like that, I don't like that. When you get one that you like, you lock it in and move on to the next chapter. So it really is not trying to create that protagonist-player sympathy, but it's trying to put the player in a completely different place with respect to the story. And it's doing that, again, by having a large corpus of available text, available symbols, available concepts, and then doing a lot of tagging and matching to find where the fits are. And then this is Storyteller, which is a project by Dan Bemergui. in which you are a comic strip artist, and on each level you select sprites that you can move into these comic strip boxes, and then the system is actually working out, depending on what characters you have where, oh, that must mean this. So it's actually playing the role of the listener or the viewer and working out what you must mean by your sprite placement. And so you go back and forth trying to move the characters around until you've managed to tell the system a story that matches the parameters for that level puzzle. And often there are multiple ways of doing that. So this is a really cool project. It's not finished yet, but there's a lot of information about it on his website if you're curious. And finally, this is a project by Andrew Gordon and Reed Swanson, which is about collaborative story generation, where the player types a line of narrative and then the system responds with another line of narrative. So it's going back and forth between you type this, I type that, you type this, I type that. And again, it's looking at a large corpus of material, in this case material that it's gotten by scraping a very large number of weblogs. So it's taking stories from all kinds of bloggers online, and then looking for what should the next sentence be. I found a close match to the sentence that the user typed, so I'm going to put in this next sentence. And it creates this kind of interesting back and forth flow in which the user is trying to keep things coherent, and the system is also in its own way trying to keep things coherent, but you get these surprising responses that you wouldn't have expected from the system. So as kind of the key points that I wanted to leave you with here, there are issues of getting the mechanics and the fiction to work together, putting the story changes on the plane of the gameplay, and that often requires the story to be adaptive in some way and the gameplay to be adaptive in some way. There's the issue of agency in story, making sure that the player is able to do things that are significant, but it doesn't break the story keeps going, it is responsive and interesting as a result of that. And finally, making the personal and the interpersonal stakes strong enough to drive the narrative forward, giving the player a reason to care about the protagonist and the other characters. And all of those things are things that can be supported by a variety of technologies, but in some cases AI can be a big help. And I just wanted to leave you with those resource links as well for other things you might want to look at. This first one is kind of a good overview of interactive narrative challenges from more of an academic standpoint. It doesn't have quite as many examples as I just went through, but it's got quite a lot of good thinking. The second one is an overview of specifically interactive story generators that have been tried through the years. So if you want to kind of see what are different academic projects that have happened, that's a good place to look. So are there any questions? I'm not seeing any here. Am I allowed to open that?
Do you want me to read them to you, Emily, or?
Yeah, I can't. For some reason, it's not letting me open the questions and look at them. So.
Okay, I'll read them to you. So there's one question that's from Amkar. Sorry if I ruin your names. How is that done in Blue Lacana? Is it all made up of ifs and ifs and elses?
I don't have the source code in front of me. It has been published, but there certainly is a certain amount of flagging like that. As I recall, and I haven't looked at it for a little while, but as I recall, there are things where there are rules where entire categories of action can be interpreted in particular ways and therefore kind of affect the character profile. So you can have rules like, you know, these objects are marked as belonging to this character, and if you do something with them, then it will cause the following reaction, and so on.
Okay. Yuri asks, do you think tool support rather than generation AI could help alleviate the content generation problem, e.g. to find stale spots in a prom week-like system?
Absolutely. I actually had a slide on this, but I cut it because this was getting too long anyway. But it's a really good point. There's a lot that's really useful to do, both in terms of tools that help you organize content, so helping you understand what the different pieces are that you've already created. That's very important. But then also something that we did for Versi that was hugely helpful was just have a system that automatically played through episodes and then produced, sort of run through this episode hundreds of times, selecting choices randomly, and then report back on things like, did you ever get stuck? Was there ever a time when the content wasn't able to provide for you? Which content avenues are being hit a lot? Which ones aren't? And you can do similar things to that in terms of exploring the state space that's been encoded to try and find where are things too sparse, where are there places where, if you're doing something where an important part of the design is about matching for salience, so you've got narrative or you've got an animation, you've got something that needs to match the world model as tightly as possible in order to present it to the player, that's a good place to use some automated systems to look at what kind of coverage you got and how tight it is and where there are dead spots.
Okay, and then since we're out of time, I'll do one last question. Ted asks, what's your view on what Storybricks has been doing or has done with SOE's EverQuest Next?
I don't know a huge amount about the current state of that project. So the last time that I looked at, or the last time that I got kind of a lot of insight into it was when they were doing their Kickstarter, and then I've been to a couple of talks on what they were doing, but I don't actually know kind of the tight details on what's happened with that since. I think it's a system that, from what I saw when it was presented in contests where I was around, it's a system that's very much about kind of selecting for things that are thematically relevant, or so it feels a bit more like sort of the Skyrim Radiance stuff than like some of the other pieces that I've looked at, in that it's trying to, in a broad brush way, find what could we do next, but the pieces may be on the generic side. But we're going for trying to make things as dynamic as possible and trading other aspects in to get that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. Everybody, thanks for joining. Next week's webinar is on game design, and Chris Crowell will be hosting Patrick Holloman to discuss the evolution of video game RPGs. He did a video game design one a couple of months ago that was really good, and I suspect this one will be really good as well. Watch for the recording of this if you missed anything, and thanks for joining.